If you look at strategic outlets, and let's classify them into two categories. Let's say there's practitioner strategic outlets like Harvard Business Review, Sloan Management Review, and there's academic strategic outlets like Strategic Management Journal. You know what you're finding that's really fascinating? In both of those outlets, both academic and practitioner, there's an increasing awareness of the supply chain. Articles which 10, 15 years ago would have never been published in those journals are now appearing in them, which talks to me about something very simple. Top management is saying, there's something out there and I don't know what it is, but I got to become aware of it. And what it's also talking about is that there's certain opportunities we've never thought about in the past. One example, 10 years ago, if I thought about performance measurement, who would I turn to for performance measurement in the firm? Accounting. Now the accountants are finding out that that performance measurement issue is moving from the accountant to the supply chain. And it's moving from being output-driven to being process-driven. It's moving from being within the department to being within the supply chain. It's moving from cost savings to revenue generation. In fact, what we're finding out is that management is starting to understand that there's gradations of performance. At the basic level, you've got cost savings. I still remember the vice president of global procurement for Harley-Davidson looking at me one day and he says, you know what the problem with cost savings is? And being the naive academic that I am, I said, no. He said, cost savings is when you make a bad decision in the past and you correct it. And he said, if you think about, there's three levels of cost savings. There's within the function, which means I do something within the function, and I don't care if it affects other people, but I look good. There's supply chain savings, there's savings within the firm, and there's savings within the supply chain. We're moving from the function to the enterprise to the supply chain. Above it is cost avoidance. Savings is making a bad mistake and correcting it. Avoidance is preventing it. The problem is firms like Toyota, Schlumberger, others, Apple, are becoming aware of the importance of avoidance. The accountants can measure cost savings. They have difficulty measuring cost avoidance. Above it is asset management. And we're starting to see that our notion of assets is broadening. It's no longer inventory, hard plant. It's intellectual property. It's relationships. And one of the things we're finding out is, in many cases, there is a real value to a supply chain relationship. 1998, Toyota company has a problem. 98% of its vehicles use a thing known as a P6 brake valve. It's sole sourced. Okay, let's ignore the fact that sole sourcing may not be the brightest thing to do. There's a fire, and what happens is that plant disappears. Literally, what's left is a hole in the ground. So bad that the company president goes around to the neighbors and apologizes for the fact that their gardens have been covered in soot. And now you have a situation, Toyota does not have a supplier. 96% of your supply is gone. GM, if you talk to GM or Ford and said, how long would it take you to recover? They would think in terms of months. You know how long it took Toyota to recover? Less than 2 weeks. And if you ask them what happened, it's the relationship. They had great relationships with their suppliers. And they went to their suppliers and said, we need the product, irrespective of the cost. And the suppliers were able to respond. One of the things Michigan State University undertook in 2005 to 2008 is we started to study supply chains. And we were starting to study the changes taking place in how managers, especially in good supply chains, viewed what was happening. One of the things that came out was that they talked about the change that was taking place. And they said that in the past, supply chains have been viewed as strategically decoupled, price-driven. And now they said that for many of them, they were talking about becoming strategically coupled, value-driven, which meant that essentially the supply chain had to deliver value for the customer. Now, as soon as we started to see that, we started to see the first thing we found was kind of interesting. There's a new set of skills. And one of the things that we heard was, we've got enough tactical supply chain managers. We have enough students being produced who are tactical. We need students and managers who are strategic, who can communicate up and down, who can relate what the supply chain can and cannot do to management so that the strategy can reflect it, and also to make management aware of the opportunities present in supply chain. That also kind of introduced us to the fact that the outcomes supply chains are starting to be asked to pursue are becoming more varied. The traditional supply chain was seen as cost. Get it faster, better, cheaper. The new supply chain is looking at cost, it's looking at responsiveness, it's looking at security, ensuring that nothing happens that either contaminates the product or allows unnecessary access to intellectual property. Resilience, reacting to issues like supply chain disruptions. Strategic resilience, which is how do you prevent yourself from how do you prevent a supplier from usurping you in the supply chain? That is, the supplier, you work with the supplier so that the supplier works with the customer, the supplier looks at you and says, why do we need you? How do you prevent hostage taking, which is you've identified a critical supplier and that supplier says, I know I'm critical, guess what? I'm going to ask for more money. We also look at things like sustainability, innovation, and I pretty well forgot one of them, but there are 6 outcomes we identified. And we found that organizations had to blend them, and that blending had to be done to generate a competitive advantage. What's interesting is recently, in the March issue of Wired magazine, they had an article which talked about the future of American manufacturing. And it said, guess what's happening? We're taking manufacturing back from China, bringing it back to the United States. And what's that mean? Well, it means we're going to have to become responsive, resilient, innovative. And ultimately, guess what? Those are all strategic supply chain issues. So therefore, if you think about what we're getting into a lot of issues where people are now looking at supply chain as almost the unknown. It's kind of like, if you don't hear about it, it's okay. If you hear about it, it's bad too. We have to know about it because we have to be able to see whether or not what's being done in the supply chain can support what we need done. So that becomes an interesting challenge. And I think one of the major challenges we're now facing is, and it's really ironic, we're getting back to some really fundamental issues in supply chain management. One example is supplier development. As a result of the outsourcing boom, whatever you want to call it, many of our smaller suppliers have gone away. Now there's a demand coming back because we're seeing right-shoring or onshoring. We may not have an adequate supplier base to support ourselves. And so that's creating a challenge for us, which is how do you develop suppliers? We're also starting to see that not only do we have that, but we're also starting to see we have to develop better models because firms not only want to be able to react to known issues, but unknown issues, such as uncertainty. So all of those are forcing us to look at the supply chain as a strategic asset, one that can generate value for the firm. And that is an opportunity for us because right now we're finding that it forces us, researchers and managers, to develop better models, frameworks. When we did the Supply Chain 2010 initiative, we found a very simple model that's the very good supply chain people had. And there are 3 circles you maintain. There's who's your critical customer, what's your value proposition, and what are your capabilities. And the goal of strategic supply chain management is to manage and maximize the overlap, which means the supply chain manager has got to understand who his critical customer is. And in many cases, they've never thought that way. You've got to ask what the value proposition. You know what we found that was interesting? A strategic value proposition is 4 traits. What is the customer willing to pay for? What differentiates us in the marketplace? Does it satisfy corporate, strategic, and financial goals? And is it supported by the capabilities? And capabilities are processes, metrics, infrastructure, culture, which is now becoming a new term we're starting to see, and not only of you, but of your supply chain. So if you put those 3 things together, that is strategic supply chain management.